Another important theme in international security, particularly in the post-September 11th world, has been the role of terrorism and then linking terrorism into what we've talked about with weapons of mass destruction. So let's begin very briefly with a quick definition of terrorism. That's not an easy thing to do. There are dozens and dozens of different definitions, each with different connotations and goals. But I think most definitions focus on most of the five following pieces, which we might describe as jointly sufficient conditions, which means if you put it all together, it's enough to be able to say, okay, this looks like a terrorist group. And I want to make a differentiation here between terrorist and terrorism. Terrorism is the act. A terrorist is somebody who commits terrorism, right? But not everything that a terrorist does is terrorism. Terrorists can do lots of other things. They can have breakfast, for example. That's not terrorism. And so we can see terrorists conducting acts of terrorism, but also conducting acts of maybe unconventional warfare or other things that might be bad, but might not be terrorism, at least not according to this definition. Right. So the beginning piece of terrorism is that terrorism uses violence, right? The blowing stuff up, destroying property, killing people, violence. A second piece of that definition is that it's carried out by individuals or by groups, but not by governments. When governments blow stuff up or kill people or destroy property, that might be bad. It might be done in a way that looks like terrorism, but it's not terrorism because we give governments this sort of special category of monopoly over violence and the right to wage war. And so that's something else that we don't consider terrorism. We have targeting of civilians. So this is another definition that maybe, or part of the definition that can maybe fluster folks. There's sort of a long discussion in the history of just war about what is an appropriate target of violence. And there's a differentiation between combatants and non-combatants. And combatants are legitimate targets, particularly in times of war, whereas civilians are generally considered to be off limits. And so terrorism crosses that boundary and goes after illegitimate targets, i.e. civilians. And so again, this is where a terrorist group can conduct acts of terrorism, driving a car into a marketplace and blowing it up, but also can conduct acts that look similar but are not considered terrorism. And so when Al-Qaeda rows a boat out next to the USS Cole stationed in Yemen and blows a hole in the side of the ship and almost sinks it, that wouldn't technically be terrorism, even though it's carried out by a group, Al-Qaeda, that conducted, hundreds of acts of terrorism over the course of its existence. A fourth piece is clandestine attack methods, right? So terrorists do not wear uniforms. They do not march in formation. They deploy secretly in cells or small units and strike in a way that doesn't look like conventional warfare. And then finally, terrorists are political, right? They have a goal. The goal is to change politics. The goal is to change society. These are not, people who are insane and are just doing this because they love violence. They're using violence to achieve specific ends. So I think when you put all of those pieces together, you get a pretty good working definition. We should also probably add in some refining conditions. What I mean by that is that not all terrorism is the same. We can maybe organize it into different groups. One important distinction would be between domestic terrorism, which is a group originates within a country and blows stuff up within that country, versus transnational terrorism, where a group originates in one country and then goes to another country and blows stuff up, so crossing borders. The vast majority of terrorism is domestic. It's not transnational. Transnational is only a small percentage. I think I've seen maybe like 3 or 4% of all terrorist acts are that sort of crossing border variety. It's just really hard to get people worked up to the point where they're willing to go and cross borders and blow stuff up in someone else's country. It's much easier to get people worked up to blow things up in their own country, I guess. And then finally, we might want to distinguish between state-sponsored terrorism versus maybe more organic terrorist groups that are operating independently. State-sponsored terrorist groups might be groups like Hezbollah, which have a state backer that helped to build them up and increase capacity, give them access to weapons and cash and budgets. Those groups historically have been viewed as much more dangerous because they have state backing behind them, whereas non-state terrorist groups are sort of at the whim of finding a safe haven where they can operate. They may struggle to find financing. They may struggle to secure weapons. They may struggle to operate in an international system that has no space for them. So important distinctions to think about. Okay, so what is going on? Why is terrorism a tool that's used by groups? What are they trying to achieve? And I would maybe draw a distinction between the power to defeat as something that you're trying to achieve with military force and the power to hurt. Terrorism is a weapon of the weak. It's used by groups that don't have broad bases of support, that don't have the ability to succeed through normal political channels, that aren't able to succeed through conventional military channels. They're not able to marshal armies and take over countries. They can't defeat conventional state militaries in anything that would look like a symmetric conflict where they're going head to head, but they do have the power to inflict pain, right, to hurt. And so they're able to blow things up and cause suffering and gain news attention and to create a sense of this can't go on, right? And so there's a specific term that's used in the conflict literature, the idea of a hurting stalemate, the idea that you can't suppress a terrorist group because it's too small and it's able to hide very effectively, but it's also able to continue to inflict so much pain that you're stuck in this sort of situation where you can't end it through military force and escalation, but it's also an unbearable situation that you really don't want to be in anymore. And that's sort of the combination that terrorism is able to achieve. It's able to inflict enough pain that a much more powerful actor will simply say, fine, I'm done. I don't want any more part of this. We'll figure out how to make this all go away. And so terrorism actually has been successful in some instances. And so I'll give you probably one of the most successful examples. In the 1980s, the United States was involved in the civil war in Lebanon and had a contingent of Marines in Lebanon and was seeking to influence that civil war. And Hezbollah launches a strike on the Marine compound and kills hundreds of US military personnel in a truck bomb. And the United States looks at that and says, okay, yeah, we're done. Like, whatever we wanted to do in Lebanon is not worth this kind of a mess. And the United States actually just withdraws from Lebanon, right? And that logic of inflicting pain to get a much more powerful actor to say, I'm done, is the core of the strategic logic of terrorism. Because they're not able to pose what we would call an existential threat to states. They're not able to take over and destroy a state in whole. The one potential sort of caveat to that would be if a terrorist organization were able to get its hands on weapons of mass destruction. And so shortly after September 11th, this became the worst case scenario, the one that drove the nightmares and loss of sleep for folks in the US security community, because it would be incredibly destructive and it could potentially be a cataclysmic existential event for a state. The good news is it's highly unlikely that terrorist organizations would be able to deliver a nuclear strike or a weapons mass destruction strike against a state in any sort of scale. And part of that is that terrorist organizations are not powerful. They're weak. They have limited resources, and they're going to have poor access to the kinds of resources that you would need: laboratories, industrial chemicals, uranium mines, massive access to electricity, the kind of things that you would need to develop your own weapons of mass destruction. And so we really haven't seen terrorist organizations developing weapons of mass destruction or deploying weapons of mass destruction, with two quick caveats. One would be in the late 1990s in Japan. There was, I guess, a death cult that had explored possibly buying a uranium mine in Australia and had given up on that, and instead had a number of PhD level chemists working or within its organization, and they were able to whip up a batch of VX nerve gas. And this group deployed that on the Tokyo subway system in backpacks and jars. And so the idea is that they walk into the subways, put the backpacks down, unscrew the tops of the jars, and just walk out. But even though they were able to have access to VX nerve gas, their delivery mechanism, their deployment, was not the kind of delivery that you'd see in a military context. And VX nerve gas is very slow to evaporate. And so it just sort of made tens of thousands of people sick, but didn't have the sort of, cataclysmic death toll that you would expect from a group that had its hands on VX nerve gas, and it could be incredibly terrifying. The other exception I would give you, it would be ISIS, which has deployed chemical weapons in Iraq and Syria against civilian populations. In some situations, it seems that they're using chemical weapons that are already there because of the Syrian government. In other situations, they're using industrial chemicals like chlorine as a weapon of warfare. It's an incredibly horrific way to die from chlorine gas, and has been certainly one of the things that has set ISIS apart as one of those vicious groups out there. But again, chlorine gas is not a existential threat to a state, even if it is a horrific war crime. And one last thing I'd maybe flag on this is that in order to secure weapons of mass destruction, if you're not in a open war warfare situation like in Syria, but instead operating within sort of the normal context of a state, you're just really hard to get your hands on this kind of stuff. And we'll talk about that in a second. Terrorists tend to use what they have handy, right? And so an AK-47 is much more likely to be used as a weapon of terrorism than a nuclear weapon, just because it's decades and decades of work to try to get your hands on a nuclear weapon, whereas an AK-47 is, easily accessible in most conflict situations. And I just also want to flag here that the challenge of acquiring versus deploying nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, biological weapons, and how much destruction they can do. And so I think this also helps maybe put in context that larger fear of the worst case scenario of a terrorist organization getting their hands on weapons of mass destruction. Sure, terrorist organizations could probably get their hands on radiological material. There's lots of it around. It's used in the medical community. It's used in industrial processes. But again, that's not particularly terrifying as an existential threat. It's the sort of dirty bomb thing that would create chaos and fear and raise birth defects, but wouldn't result in a massive death toll. So you can get your hands on that potentially. If you want to get your hands on weapons grade uranium, that's really, really, really hard to do. And terrorist organizations appear not to have been able to have come close in spite of decades of trying. Biological and chemical weapons, maybe a little bit easier. As I said, chlorine gas is certainly much more accessible than VX nerve gas. Biological weapons, salmonella, very accessible. Smallpox, not so accessible. Most smallpox exists in controlled laboratories. It's highly regulated. It would be very, very difficult to get your hands on. But even if you get your hands on something really, really awful, like a quantity of the VX nerve gas, it can be very difficult to weaponize this stuff in a way that's incredibly effective. And so even we've seen with anthrax, which has been developed in military context as a biological weapon. Shortly around the time of September 11th, there was a series of envelopes that had been laced with a white powder which had anthrax in it. The idea is that you open up the mail and this powder flies up and you breathe it in and you contract anthrax and die. And in fact, an individual in Florida did die from one of these anthrax letters. But they were also sent to Tom Brokaw with NBC News and to Tom Daschle's office, South Dakota senator. In spite of the sort of large number of people who came in contact with these anthrax spores, very few people died from them, in part because it's really hard to weaponize that in a way that would be effective, right? Because you have to breathe the stuff in, it has to get stuck in your lungs, and so it can infect you. And that means that the particles have to be small enough to get in deep, but if they're too small, they go in, they get breathed out. It's quite the challenge actually to make that an effective weapon of war. And whipping things up in your apartment or on a farmstead isn't a ideal environment for kind of testing the effectiveness of these weapons. These are major scientific undertakings that require massive resources. One, again, sort of caveat in terms of this, right? If you want to get your hands on weapons grade uranium, that's almost impossible. There was a huge fear at the end of the Cold War that there might be these things called suitcase nukes, that the Soviet Union might have developed and built these super tiny nuclear weapons that you could fit in a suitcase and kind of roll around. And that would be something that would be incredibly easy to deploy. And there was the fear that maybe these things walked off and disappeared from Soviet military bases. And so the US and others spent a decade plus trying to track down and figure out where these things were. As far as we can tell, they haven't really turned up, if they existed at all. And so I don't know that that's something that's really worth losing sleep over, that the Soviet Union might have miniaturized nuclear weapons that might have disappeared, and somebody with bad intent might be able to find one of these things that the intelligence community has been looking for decades and been unable to really find.